Hi, you're now watching part two of our two-part video series called Untangling the Mod Words. It's especially geared to help people who are going to study cultural history subjects at an academic level and to get the hang of four different words that start with mod: modernization, the modern era, modernity, and modernism. Untangle them, make sure we use them properly. And we are partway through the second one, the modern era. We've just looked at one of the systems that characterizes and changes all life, changes how we think during the modern era. That was government. We're going on now to look at science, then industry, and then continue on to the two other mod words. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoy it. The scientific revolution starts with a few people thinking differently and results in everyone thinking differently. One thing we should not take scientific revolution to mean is that a new thing called science exploded onto the world at this time. Science was already ancient, and the big scientific innovations that were already part of the Western world were not only from the Greeks, but from India, Africa, the Middle East, and China. The changes in the scientific method. That comes about not through one person, but several across Europe, of whom only a few were Johannes Kepler, Nicholas Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Francis Bacon. These people start practices such as observation and recording, testing, repeating tests, and making hypotheses, which they would then test. Now, we would look at those practices and say, well, obviously, that's science. That's how you do science. Well, that shows you how big an impact the scientific method has had on us and our thinking, because in their own time, that stuff wasn't obvious. The previous priority of science had been authority. So when people ask, why were the Roman Catholic Church so bothered about hanging on to what two pagans, Aristotle and Ptolemy, had said about the sun and planets orbiting the Earth? That's the answer: authority. They had accepted and backed the propositions of Aristotle and Ptolemy, which had authority through being long-standing, and anything new ought to have come from them, not from an ordinary person like Galileo, because they were the authority. Galileo could prove it all, but it was by the by whether it could be proven. Proof didn't make things true. Authority did. Of course, the problem with scientific truths on that basis was that they couldn't be applied to anything. What happened when tested scientific knowledge was accepted? It could be applied to things. So new things could be invented. Cures and treatments for illnesses were discovered, and people like Isaac Newton could discover gravity, which opened the door to many new discoveries. The branches of science that we know, physics, chemistry, biology, etc., emerged from this time, but what was meant by a scientist wasn't just restricted to those fields. A scientist was someone who used the scientific method. That's why René Descartes was a philosopher, a mathematician, and a political scientist. It wasn't viewed as three different jobs, but just as applying the scientific method to three different parts of life. Ideas and numbers are non-physical objects, metaphysical objects, but the scientific method was still applied to them. I'm a historian. I don't study the sciences, but I was trained to study history using the scientific method. Gathering research, testing propositions, backing them up with evidence, referencing sources. Today, if you want to prosecute someone, you have to prove that they did what you're accusing them of. Every proposition is tested against evidence, and one person doesn't decide the verdict. A jury does. That's repeating the test. When TV news reports an incident, they have a reporter in the place where the story is happening to verify it. This is a method we accept as normal, and expect it to be applied in all parts of everyday life. That once new authority of the scientific method continues to be our authority, which is why we're still in the modern era. And that brings us on to our third system, industry. Now, this change is obviously very dependent on the scientific revolution, which was already underway. It's the application side of science. In physics, we learn about energy and forces and how both can be generated and directed. We can apply that to inventions that make things. So after countless centuries, machines are starting to replace animals. People have been making things and selling them since time immemorial. That's what industry is, making things and selling them. The scientific revolution certainly revolutionized industry, but we need to add to that confidence, imagination, and freedom. So, which system of government under which you lived had a part to play in that? And the result was rapidity. Big technological breakthroughs are made in great number very quickly, one after the other. My picture examples here are spinning jenny. That's invented in 1764. Only 20 years later, we have a steam-powered vehicle. That's a very rapid change, very rapid development in technology. Now, that rapidity hasn't ended, which is why we're still in the Industrial Revolution. These changes make the members of that class in society who make and sell more powerful, which is what enables events such as the French Revolution. An enduring mindset is that we see the value of efficiency and its impact on productivity. There are modern era words. That mindset doesn't stay restricted to industry. I think like wherever you work, that kind of model exists. And there are certainly a great deal of positive results from that, but negative impacts too. Slavery was far from a new thing. That was also an ancient practice, but industrialized slavery became horrific. As the values of efficiency and productivity increased, the value of humanity decreased. Human beings were absolutely considered and treated as a commodity, something that societies were gradually outgrowing. In the medieval period, slavery becomes reinvigorated and justified in the modern period. A backward step alongside the forward steps. Because unfortunately, because the scientific method becomes established, there's kind of a new way simply to justify your actions, where if you kind of frame it in a sort of scientific, pseudo-scientific way, and there's a lot of pseudoscience in this era, you add an authority to your actions. That's a kind of an unfortunate development of the scientific method. Child labour was common in industrial settings, and the working conditions led to serious injuries, deaths, and the spread of diseases because of the proximity of people in their working conditions. And longer term effects are the ones we're aware of today on the planet. And people who are sceptical about such big changes being brought about in the last 50 years forget that they're the results of the last 250 years. The Industrial Revolution clearly is evidenced in things around us that we see, but it's the reason for a lot of how we live and what we see as normal. Most people in any country live in and around urban centres. Most people travel further than walking distance to go to work. Very normal things to us. They're post-industrial normalities. As mentioned already, the main legacy of the modern era is in how we think. The only systems of government that we deem acceptable or regard as government at all come from since the start of the modern era. Let alone scientific proof, we accept or verify any kind of information based on the scientific method. Even people who dispute the findings of science dispute it using scientific methods. We routinely ask how as well as why. Wouldn't have been the case necessarily in previous eras. We are scientifically minded. It's true to say that we have a lot in common with people from far back in history, but it's not true to say that we think the same. Modernised technologies, specifically these systems mentioned, have changed what crosses our mind first, what questions we ask, what we expect, and what we view as normal. So that was a long one, I know, the modern era. Come on to our third mod word, modernity. And remember, I gave you the type word for modernity. It's a condition. And it requires a type word that's broad and that makes the human subject suitably passive. Modernity isn't a buy-in or opt-out kind of a thing. It's something that we are just in, and it is in us. Now, I don't mean this entirely negatively, but perhaps a helpful comparison would be the recent pandemic, because that was just there, in the space that we were in, and we were all affected by it. Disliking or objecting to it was just another way to be affected by it. So let's go on to our rough definition. Remember, our type word is condition. Modernity is the condition of rapid modernization becoming normality. So we've seen the rapid changes of the Industrial Revolution. You could observe that it begins by changing certain areas of life profoundly. We start to think of the condition of modernity being in place when its technologies have changed all aspects of life. A way to solidify that is to think of particular technologies. How about one of the big ones? Railways. The static steam engine is used in industries, and the first mobile ones travel along rails, used for industrial transport. So far, this changes your life profoundly if you work in that job. But if you live in a cottage in the countryside, your life isn't profoundly altered by that invention. Later, though, when that invention has grown to transport people, and there is a network of rails for it to travel on across the whole land, everyone's life, including yours in your country cottage, is profoundly altered. That's in so many ways. I could easily do a series of videos just on modernity, or just on the many impacts of railways, in fact. So the Industrial Revolution is not identical on the timeline to modernity because it takes time for people to enter into that condition. Its technologies do only alter specifics to begin with. For the art historians watching, consider how it affected how often someone saw a picture. In 1800, still many people saw very few, perhaps the altarpiece at their local church. But once people live in urban centres, this changes in two stages not very far apart from each other in time. Firstly, cities gather pictures together in museums, which people are now walking distance from. Then there is mass reproduction of images, so you could even own your own prints of those pictures. So to show how rapid change was, consider that if someone lived from 1810 to 1880, they would have experienced no pictures except the church altarpiece, pictures on display in cities, pictures reproduced in print, advertising prints all over the urban space, photography being invented, so spookily real reproducible images that I think took people a long time to get used to. And then before they were used to them, moving images with the invention of cinema. That's one lifetime, one single generation becomes normality. And that's why we are still in the condition of modernity. Modernity didn't take us long, you notice. Okay, so our fourth mod word, modernism. We notice that this is the only term on our timeline with a beginning and an end. As happens when you are under a condition, modernity, you respond to it. That's not something that people wait until about 1880 to do, but it's a stage in response where people don't rely on older, familiar language to respond. It's in that sense that I choose the type word language. So here's our rough definition using our type word. Modernism is language for the personal and shared experiences of modernity. A short aside here, be careful of the ism. When an ism is put at the end of something, it doesn't always mean the same thing. So we can't from this point on conclude that ism means language for or response to something. Look at another ism word, that's not what they're trying to say. So even my vague type word, language, needs to be treated delicately, because it's not true to say that the theme of Matisse or Picasso's painting was modernity. They weren't restricted in any sense in that way. We can't apply anything as direct as that as a rule. It might apply more so to some. For instance, the Futurist group did have a celebration of technology and progress in its manifesto. The Brücke were concerned with finding language to express their own age. But people like Cézanne or Kandinsky were exploring painting itself. Munch and Schiller were concerned with the personal psychological experience. And Grant Wood disagreed with modern trends and actively resisted them, but still created unique visual language in the process. In practice, what you find in the arts is a re-examination of the medium you're working in and considering if there are experiences that are very real but haven't been communicated using the traditional ways. Literature is a good example of this. A novel was always written as a rolled out narrative recalled by the protagonist in the first person or by a narrator in the third person. Modernist authors like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf write novels where personal thoughts are recorded as they're experienced. That's called stream of consciousness. You don't actually even need very much to actually happen in the novel's narrative. The plot no longer drives the novel as it had done. Good literature had always been presumed to need a lot of words to make it effective. Ernest Hemingway writes novels very economically. He brings his training as a journalist into his method as a novelist. William Carlos Williams really presented the bare bones in his poetry. The Bauhaus group aimed at designing buildings and furniture where no part of the object was purely decoration, but was all part of what it did. Form followed function. So limitations birthed creativity. There are plenty of things, especially experiences, that are very real, but can't be seen or touched. You can't put it in front of you, like a bowl of fruit, and draw it or paint it. Those non-visible, non-touchable things are called abstracts. And artists become very interested in trying to make visible interpretations of them. Abstraction, another thing really important to see the difference between abstract and abstraction. Abstraction is kind of going in the opposite direction. It's taking the visible, recognizable thing and making it less like we expect it to be to see if we think differently about it. When people say abstract to mean colours and lines, it's making a comparison with styles for representing abstracts that have become well known, rather than saying the definition of abstract painting is colours and lines. Another quick note. In your specific field of study, there may be modernists identified in that specific field of study where it doesn't have this broad meaning behind it. I know that's the case in theology. There's people identified as modernist theologians. So just be careful in your field of study. The works and styles that come from modernism continue to be very influential. But in historical terms, modernism refers to the period of its freshness and its domination. That's why in historical terms, it has an end. And there's a lot more to say about that, but if I say much more, that's going to take me into the post-mod words, which we're not going to untangle in this video. All I will say in this video is that the prefix we have there, post, is used to mean after, also to mean outside of or not along the same lines. So have a think about what things you know occur around the period at the end of this yellow block and what its impacts might have been. So that was all of our mod words, which we can help untangle by putting on a timeline and by pinning down their types. I recommend the practice as well of considering what you already know. you're likely to find particularly helpful prompts, personal to you, that are more likely to stick in your memory. And whatever you think of is likely to link. For instance, Americans watching, hello. You might look at the date 1600, and that reminds you that this was the early phase of Europeans migrating to America. Well, that's very much linked to systems of government of the time and the will to try new systems that included freedom of religion. That can remind you that new systems of government are a key feature of the modern era. If you're looking at the 19th century, that might remind you that your favourite sports team was founded in the 19th century. Working class people live in larger numbers in urban centres and can organise into special interest groups, including sports teams. That points you towards modernity. Our sports clubs of today are a product of modernity. The last thing, just to give some attention to, is the adjective modern. We generally understand it to mean new or of now. But in academic terms, we need to look at the context to get how that adjective is being used in that instance. The term modern art is a case in point. When someone uses that term, they may be referring to the art of now, to contemporary art, in fact, or they might be meaning art from the modernist period, so art that's sort of 70 years old or older, so not really new or of now. Sometimes, actually, people use the term modern art to mean challenging art. What they find challenging is largely unique to them, but it needn't be new or of now to be challenging for them. People find Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon challenging. That's a 117-year-old painting. People find Munch's The Scream challenging. That's a 131-year-old painting. A reviewer might call a novelist the Jane Austen of the modern era. Well, historically speaking, that's a bit meaningless because the actual Jane Austen lived in the modern era. Jane Austen was the Jane Austen of the modern era. But that reviewer, probably when they're saying of the modern era, is meaning to say of today or of recent times. So there is more previous understanding behind these terms and that adjective modern in the academic world than in the world in general. And you can dispute and argue against them, of course, but you do need to show that you know what you're arguing against. Important. Okay, well, I hope I've been able to help you untangle those terms. If you're going on to one of those courses, all the best. I'm a bit jealous. I absolutely loved my time at uni. That's why I basically continue to do what I did at uni in my spare time. Make sure you enjoy it. I'm definitely biased, but I think it's a very interesting learning space to be in. Hope I helped. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.